So welcome everyone to Modern Change Academy. So for those who are new, this is a series of live sessions focused on simplifying and streamlining your change and release processes while enhancing governance for each. So these take place on the fourth Thursday of every month at this same time. Today, we're going to be covering reducing risk with advanced policies in DPR or digital product release. So I have Colin O'Brien with me, who is our lead inbound product manager for DPR, and he's going to cover the bulk of the content. So before we jump in, just so folks know, please, we'll try and stop periodically for questions throughout the session. Please post them as we go. Please use the Q&A function to post your questions. So we'll try and address some as you post them there, or I'll flag them and I'll pause the session so Colin can address them live. So please just post your questions there. At times we'll ask for folks to raise their hand if they want to come off mute to ask questions, but for now, I think we can jump in. Okay, before we go, we have our safe harbor. So there may be some forward-looking statements in this presentation. So please don't take anything as set in stone, as it's all subject to change. Okay, so let's do a quick refresher on DPR. I won't spend too much time here because I know we're going to get into some of the advanced topics, and I want to spend the bulk of the session there. So DPR is designed to help organizations manage the process in which they ensure products are ready to deploy. DPR does not encompass the capabilities to actually do the testing, deployment, or management of the product. So it's really this release process orchestration tool that we put together to facilitate validating when your code is ready to be released, and then you can eventually submit the change. We have a lot of deep dive content covering DPR at a higher level, all posted to the community site, and there's some links later in the deck. So for now, I won't spend much time here, but if you want to dive deeper and if you're newer to the product, please go take a look at those recordings. We have our DPR deployment journey broken out into this adoption journey. We've covered the various phases of these at previous sessions. We also have a good video walkthrough on the community site. We have this also put up into an adoption playbook, which really double clicks into each of these different maturity levels available to us as well. So if you want to deep dive there, we can do that. But today we're going to focus more on this advanced automation and approval policies section. So back in April, we did a session on how DPR can help simplify and streamline change management. So really doing a deep dive in how you can take validations that many folks are doing as part of change, and how you can use DPR to move them earlier in the process and use a dedicated release application to do that. So how you can separate all those validations that should be in release and put them in the release product, so then you can simplify and streamline your change management. So today we're going to build on that content. So we'll refresh on some of the content we covered in that, but we're really going to get into advanced automation with policies. So that concept of simplifying change can be done throughout this whole maturity journey, but today we're really going to focus on what you can do with advanced policies, how you can use these to reduce risk, to simplify change, and ultimately to streamline your whole release process. So with that, before we move further, I do still see some hands. Olaf, did you have a question? I'll make you allowed to talk before we jump in.
I don't see Greg in Q&A, and also there's one thing posted into the chat, and we will post a link to the community page. It's both in this presentation, so it'll be at the end, but we'll just put a link to it in chat so you can quickly get to it as well.
Yes, yeah. So yeah, we have it in here. I'll put the link to the community page. I'll also put a link to just we have recordings of all the different Modern Change Academy sessions as well. So if you want to view any of those past sessions, I'll share that link here as well. Or if you go in community and just search Modern Change Academy, you can find it. So we'll post all those good links, and then they're available towards the end of the deck. And I know this deck will be shared with participants as well. Okay, with that, I think one more, Dionisio, did you have a question? Hand's been up since we okay. So no, so Colin, I think with that, I'll hand it over to you and we can jump in.
All right, sounds good. Okay, so hello everybody. As Greg said, my name is Colin O'Brien. I am a part of the product management team in ITSM. I cover digital product release, and I've been a part of the kind of DevOps change, kind of the automating change for quite some time. And so I'm going to start with just a little bit of background, and a lot of this, I'm sure most of the people on this call have familiarity, where, within ITIL, we have these kind of core types of change, whether it's, standard, emergency, or normal. And depending on what it is that you are releasing and how you're releasing it, many of those, I would say, fall into normal change. So for instance, if you are grading ServiceNow, and it's the first time you're taking on that particular version of ServiceNow, or you're rolling out a new version of SAP, or you have some custom applications internally, and you're releasing a version of that product for the first time. Those really all fall into normal change, which can start to make normal change fairly bulky, and which is honestly the primary purpose for having change models, which we're going to use for today, and how we can simplify things by breaking out, normal change into smaller kinds of normal changes, whether that's an application change, or maybe it's more of a software infrastructure change or patching Windows. And your first batch of patches might fall under normal, whereas the rest of them fall under standard change, because once you've done it, and you validated that the patching process is good and that version of Windows isn't going to like take down the whole internet, then we know that we can run it through standard change and automate more and more of that process. But the area that we are really going to be focused on are the different kinds of normal changes. Since standard is pre-authorized, they're usually more streamlined anyways. So for normal change, I'm going to show an example today of how we take what started off in DevOps change as a way to have more of the development inputs into change and try to automate the authorization by leveraging data, how we can move these earlier in the process. So when DevOps change first started, for those of you that are unfamiliar with DevOps change velocity, DevOps change velocity was focused on saying things like we had a lot of customers that had policies. For instance, all stories are approved, that there aren't critical vulnerabilities, that our testing has satisfied our minimum testing thresholds. And so we put them into change approval policies. But then as we started rolling this out to customers, we started getting asked, how can we validate those things, but before we have a change? And again, that came up time and time again, which was a lot of the design decisions behind digital product release, which is taking the same concepts but applying it throughout the release process. So instead of waiting until the end when you're trying to authorize a change, we should be doing many of those checks early in the process. So before we get out of planning, we might want to know things like, and this is one customer that I've worked with, they have a requirement that says all the stories have to be in a ready state. So we know that what we are planning is what we want to actually deliver. And then during the build portion of time for the release, we're looking at data from the development team to look at things like, is code coverage where it needs to be? Do all the code commits link back to a story? So we have an audit of why we are working on that particular set of code. That our unit tests have to be in a certain place. And then we get into release testing. There could be sign-offs that, architecture is good with it. We might have user acceptance testing. Maybe some of that user acceptance testing is automated. Maybe some of it requires people to attest to the fact that it functions as designed. We shouldn't wait until we have a change request to know if we've met those requirements. And so with DPR on that early in the maturity side, most of that's going to be handled by tasks. It's going to be handled by people going in and saying, I did testing. Yes, all the stories are good. Yes, we did our practices, but it'll be people attesting to those things being completed. But as we become more and more mature, we start getting this data in through automated systems. We can connect to Agile 2.0 and ServiceNow, or connect to Jira or ADO and pull story information from there. We can connect to GitHub or GitLab and pull in code information there, or from Jenkins and pull in the build information, the tests. And while that's the majority of the kind of data that we tend to find within DPR, and so we have out-of-box policies for those, we're not limited to just things in a development tool chain. If there is data that we can use in order to validate moving from one phase to the next, then we can use it within DPR. And that allows us to simplify changes so we know for purpose that release management is about validating that something is ready. Change, we're going to simplify all of those policies to see that change is going to be focused on how we make sure that the operational side, that we won't have a large amount of downtime, or this isn't maybe impacting a critical system during a period where we don't do deployments, like if it's the holidays and we don't want to do a change during that time. Those are more operational policies that should just know that the thing we're deploying did everything it was supposed to make sure it was ready. So we can separate out those concerns, thus simplifying the change management side by leveraging the same data earlier in the process within release management. And also, release management is more designed for having different ways of working between different product teams. Maybe internally built applications go through a different set of policies than externally visible. Though that's all easily configured within release management because of all the different processes that can exist within an organization to say, how do we know that this product is ready to release? Because again, as Greg said at the beginning, that is our core goal. Are we ready to release? So DPR ships with a bunch of out-of-the-box policies. And these are more of the automated validation policies. We also have things like have all the approvals taken place. But when we're looking at especially the development data, uh, we come with out-of-box policies. But you can add additional policies. They work different from how change approval policies work, and that each of them are kind of independent, and they'll say whether they're compliant or not. They're not for routing, they're just for answering the question, are we compliant, yes or no? So we ship with a bunch, but you can add more. And we're going to go through how, this will be the second half of the demonstration for today. We can go through how to build those more as a way to help. If you do have policies, you can more talk with the ServiceNow team, because oftentimes they're going to be the ones helping to build out those policies and make sure that all the data is in ServiceNow so that those policies are looking at the right set of data. So with that, we're going to start with how we can move the data out of change policies and into DPR. That'll be the first half for today. Now, before I go into the demo, I just wanted to check, Greg, are there any questions that I should answer now, since this is a good stopping point, or yeah, I can keep going.
Yeah, we just had one real quick. Can we use DPR for Kubernetes releases or for microservices?
Yes. So DPR generically refers to things as products or applications. So if it's software and you are building and deploying it, then yes. Now, the thing to keep in mind, we're not a deployment tool. So we're not going to tell Kubernetes to deploy whatever your microservice is, or scale up or scale down the number of instances, the number of pods there are. We're going to validate that the microservice is ready to then be used by those deployment tools to spin them out. And so we can work at high levels, like the kind of the big monolithic application side of things, or we could work on the small microservice as well. If it's something you're going to release, then DPR can be used to make sure that it is ready to be released. And while it's not in, I don't have it in the PowerPoint for this one. We did another session that was recorded on how DPR works with the Common Services Data Model. And I go into that in a bit more depth on how those things are then structured in DPR and in ServiceNow in general, so you can capture and test microservices.
Great. And then I think you're probably going to cover this in the demo, but do you configure which out-of-the-box release policies are active? I think you'll cover that in the
Yeah,
demo.
I'll cover that in just a moment.
Great. And then one more, I think this would be a good one to cover. So we do not have DCB or DPR. So we do not have DevOps change velocity or DPR. However, we do have gates and Azure DevOps that result in change requests being created at deployment. Do you recommend customers start with DPR or DCB first?
So you can start with either. We tend to find, because DevOps changing change management at ServiceNow usually takes a bit more effort because it's highly leveraged, it's highly utilized. And so the actual effort involved in actually modifying and adding policies into change can just be more time consuming. And since DPR is a new product and there's not a release solution typically in place, it tends to be easier to get started with DPR. And in fact, Greg, I don't know if we have the exact statistics, but around half of the customers that have gone live have done it on their own, because getting started is a pretty simple process. We even have, and you'll see it when I start sharing my instance, we guide you through it until you get to things like connecting to external tools or building extra policies. There's not a whole lot that tends to be needed to be done to DPR to get it stood up. It can be done pretty quickly. If you're going for the basic, let's just start managing our process and having people attest to completing these activities, as we start pulling in data and turning it into automated policies. Now, another important thing to note, the data behind DevOps change and the data behind DPR is the same data. Once you've implemented one, once you've connected Jira or GitHub or whatever, if you've done it once, it works for both. So you don't have to do it again. So you can do either. We are finding, though, DPR is just because oftentimes release isn't an implemented capability. It's just easier to get it up and running. Much less time, much less changed process needed.
Okay, I think with that you can see. We just had two. Yeah, you can go into the demo, and we can come back to some of these new ones that are popping up.
Okay, perfect. And yeah, if one, Greg, as we've talked, if one comes that's really interesting, then just let me know and I'll switch over.
Yep, we'll do.
Okay, so I'm not going to be going through a full DPR demo for today, but just to highlight from that last question I was answering, when you're an admin, we have this panel. If you're not an admin, you won't see it, to help you understand what do you need to do to get ready. These first three are the primary ones. Once you have defined your process, your approval definitions, once you have activated which policies you are going to leverage, and after you've created a release template, once you've completed these three tasks, then DPR can start being adopted. It won't be automated yet because you'll have people that need to attest to things like stories are done and tests are ready. But those are the only steps necessary to get up and running, and it doesn't require a ServiceNow sysadmin to do those activities. Now, I'll go ahead and click on the Activate Policies option to navigate me to the policies so that we can just, again, kind of review what those are. So if I go to Activate Policies, it's going to navigate me into the policy administration area of DPR, and we will have all of the policies that we have. Now, I've already activated pretty much all of them. We do have, they are grouped, so state of active. These are inactive ones that I've cloned at some point in time to just kind of use as examples. But these will not show up. So if you were to make a new policy, it will start off in an inactive state. It won't be usable while you develop it. Once it's gotten to a point where it is usable, it does what you need, then you activate it, which I'm actually going to do this in the second half of the demo. It'll turn into an active policy, which you can use to within your releases themselves. Now, I have more than just our out-of-box policies. We sometimes create examples. One that I'm going to go into in the second half is this external temperature example where Joe, one of the other outbound product managers, created a policy that checks the temperature at his house as a policy that can be used. So we're gonna dig into that one as an example. But these are my active policies. And the important part is that many of these are going to look very familiar if you have worked with DevOps change or if you have seen a demo of DevOps change, because we have, I'm going to navigate into the change approval policies. Our goal is that we move from this, which is a DevOps change request advanced automated policy, looking at things like code coverage, load tests, integration testing, code security, all of these. We want to pull out most of these tests. Now, some of them are useful to be in the change side. So for instance, number of current outages. That is something that should be looked at on the change side, because if we have an outage right now, that has no bearing on whether or not the next version that we want to deploy has done everything necessary. It is very important to know whether or not we can do a deployment right now, or if we need to, maybe what we're actually releasing is something that's going to fix all these outages. But if there are outages, maybe it needs to go through CAB. Or maybe it needs to go through some other process. That is an operational check and is an example of something that should be in a change policy and should not be a release policy. Release policies are, things like we have all our code coverage, or legal has signed off on it, that we're not using third-party dependencies that we're not allowed to use. Those items are meant to be for release. So my example is an example that I built that has a couple of things. First of all, if I can. First is an example, and this is so that you can again not have to modify existing processes. We're trying to migrate things, and this is where change models become extremely important. So I had created ahead of time a change model called a software release. And the software release, if you were to look at it, will look very much like a normal change. So, and in fact, the type for this software release is a normal change. It has I pulled out the assess because assess was, in this example, done during the release. We assessed that the release itself was doing what it needed. But it's basically using for authorize that we transition from authorized to scheduled based on when it's approved. So once the authorization is approved and we're within, the like everything else is looking good, like I could probably make this an automated transition that we can transition from authorized to schedule when the change request is approved. So it's a very simple concept. But how we know that it is approved is it is a change approval policy that I also made called software release policies. And remember from a moment ago, we were looking at things like the status of test results and things like that. But instead, we have a very simple decision that says if the release phase is compliant or compliant with exceptions. So especially if you're using our IRM and you have the compliance team involved, and maybe they sign off on things that are, it's not technically compliant, but we've got an exception in place so you can move forward anyways. That's a valid state as well. So if our readiness phase, this is the phase of the release that says we are good to go, if it is compliant, then we can just approve. We can do I did an automated approval and I just marked it as DevOps auto approved as the outcome if you have a release that is ready. Compared to my change approval for the advanced policy, where I have auto approve, but I have all of these, this is my criteria for the change approval policy. Code coverage has got to be greater than 70%. We can't have any commits without work items. Integration tests have to have 0 failures. We have to have a small number of commits. Maybe we actually want to keep the number of commits as an operational piece. All of these, like many of the, like risk, that is definitely something that should be on the operational side. But most of these can be extracted out so that we don't use them in DPR. What also gives us this ability is what if you have slightly different criteria for different kinds of products? If it's in the change policies, then you have to have lots of change policies that will look at all those different kinds of applications. Whereas if we simplify it, again, to the one that I have for the software is just saying, look at the release. Is the release compliant? If it is, then we're good. So I've basically moved out many of those checks into DPR. So what that looks like in DPR is I have a release. So if I go into my releases and I want to look at, I think this one has those same policies. So this one's running long. But if I have policies in development, and of course I picked one where, so I'll just attach these. So these would be done normally this would be done with a template. A template will just automatically associate these. But instead of having them on the change, they're mapped to one of the phases of the release. I could have different policies all along the way, but the important thing to note is that when we get to this, at the end of this phase, this is my release readiness phase. If all of the policies up until then are passing, then it means that the change can be authorized. We don't have to manage it on a different change model basis. We just simplify things by moving it to being a check on this particular phase of the release that has change requests. So if I if I have this change, so Collins change, this change will look at the data from the release because I have a change policy of this is a software release. So when I create a release, it's a software release. Once I've made it, so this can be Collins other release or other change. I'm very creative when it comes to naming things. Then this change is going to look at when I get to the authorized state. It's going to look at this release to say, have I accomplished all of my policies? So in this case, all of my approval tasks are complete. That's how I get out of planning. In development, I look at things like code coverage and stories are done, and code commits have all been done. When I move further, I'm not sure if these have any policies, they don't, but this particular phase is going to look at and only be compliant if all the preceding phases have also been compliant, thus simplifying the change process by leveraging this data earlier. So we know earlier whether or not we've made whether we've managed our policies along the way, and simplifying things. So next is how we do the policies. So we'll go more in depth on the policies. So this is another good break point, Greg, if there are any questions that have come up on how we leverage change models and leverage automated policies that look at the release policies instead of having them all built into change management.
So nothing, not a question specifically on that, but just another question on DPR. So we're
Sure.
just more about the roadmap. So we're in the process of implementing DPR. Something that comes up often is the ability to have risk assessments on the release level. Is that something on your
Mhm.
roadmap?
Yeah, so it is something on our roadmap. It's something that we're looking at next year, and it is a part of a broader um, it's part of a broader feature where we are going to be doing, think of like assessments along the way. So if we're wanting to do like just ask questions um, before we get to planning, or in order to exit planning and go into development, we need to answer some assessments. We're going to have those along the way, and those assessments will then be used to calculate things like risk. Now, today we have a risk score, but that is based on how you are doing with your policies compared to how much time is left. So this isn't a like risk assessment kind of form. So yes, it's on a roadmap, but it's on a roadmap for next year. And Greg, if you can grab whoever it was that asked the question, because when we start interviewing, um, it'd be good to, if you're willing, whoever asked the question, if you're willing to participate, that would be helpful for us to learn what kinds of things you're wanting us to ask to get that risk assessment.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll mark them down. And I think with that, you can proceed.
Okay, sounds good. So let's switch over real quick to. All right, so with custom policies, they're going to be leveraged in the exact same way that the out-of-box policies are. But what we typically find is that if when you are defining your release process, you have people attesting to things. Those are really good places to start with understanding what it is that you want to turn into an automated policy. So we leverage the policy as code engine. It's kind of a platform capability. It's not something that you would be using. It's tied into products of ServiceNow, but it's a broader capability that for those customers that are using integrated risk does tie in to our integrated risk management. So the policies in DPR can validate controls within IRM. If you're not using IRM, then the policies in DPR are simply used to gate moving through the release process. But there's a good connection between case policies and IRM if you're wanting to have more automated controls, automated governance from what goes on within DPR. And you can define any number of these policies. Now, I'm going to go into the policies themselves and talk about how they work. Some aspects of this are quite technical. Some aspects of it are not. And that was designed intentionally because getting to data within ServiceNow, depending on where it is, might require scripting. If you need to access data outside of ServiceNow, then it will require scripting. And the example I'm going to use is based on that getting data outside of ServiceNow. It's a kind of a fun example. I really liked, I use it now all the time, that Joe put together for looking at temperature. He lives in Florida. Um, so he can use the temperature lookup from the National Weather Service to leverage as a policy. So it does not have to be data only within ServiceNow, but obviously if it's in ServiceNow, it can also be used later for audit purposes. So with that, I'll switch back into my instance and go into policy administration. So let's talk a little bit about the anatomy of a policy, and I'll use this external temperature just to use at first. So policies, it started off being the policy as code engine, and originally required that you program all of it in order to create policies, hence the code part of the policy as code engine. But there's now an option where you can, and the default option is you can use conditions in the condition builder in order to create your policies. Policies are also versioned. So only one version can be active at a time, but and so that we can deal with audit, if a policy does change over time, you still have the historical how did that policy work at the point in time where it was leveraged. So this is version 2.0 of the policy. And because it is an active policy, I cannot edit it. So I've got a description, temperature is too high, and this is going to look at a data collector, and it's going to use that as the source of information, which then has if it's greater than or is some threshold, which is a parameter that's configured. Then we say that the condition is non-compliant, and we log a message that says it's too hot. It's just too hot outside, and we output so that we have for audit what was the temperature, so we have that as our result. So we have here the notion of a data collector that I'm going to go in more depth on, and then we have configuration parameters. On the right-hand side, we have what are known as API variables. So there's some things that DPR is passing in all the time. So the versions of the artifact are arrays, if you're doing DevOps, pipelines, so that we can get to this data. Then we have configuration parameters. So there are 3 configuration parameters in this case. We need to know what the threshold is, what's the temperature, and we do need to know our location, longitude and latitude. That way, this policy can be re-leveraged in multiple places. So you could have a temperature that, or a longitude and latitude for different parts of the world if you wanted to have different policies that looked at different parts of the world. And then obviously a threshold in order to know what we're going to be basing this on. We also have references to the record itself. You won't see it here, but we can leverage record references. And then we have finally our data collectors. This data collector is going to be using the longitude and latitude, and it's going to output the temperature, and it'll be a string for the temperature status. I don't remember if it's in Fahrenheit or Celsius, but that would just be something during implementation. But having data collectors, and this is the important thing, data collectors are the highly technical side so that the release administration side can deal with conditions. Because getting external data, which you can leverage in lots of different policies, requires scripting. How you use this data is in conditions. And you will find that pattern throughout the policies of DPR. So this 75% code coverage. We have right now this one's in draft, so I can actually edit it. It's going to reference the either API variables or I don't know if this one has a data collector. It doesn't. But it's going to leverage the data coming in order to decide whether or not something is compliant. So let me pull up maybe one of the ones we ship with. So all stories have code commits. So you'll see this one checks, is the epic list empty? If it is, and it uses a data collector, commits for work items. If it's true, then it's compliant because the list of epics is empty, and therefore, since we have 0 stories, we're just going to decide that it's compliant. Maybe that's not correct for you. You want to ensure that there are epics. Like there's got to be at least one story. Then in that case, you could actually modify our out of the box to say that it's not compliant, that this should not be empty. And again, this one also says no stories. Then we also say it's compliant. We eventually come down, and if none of the other ones work, we say it's non-compliant because we have stories that are not, or code commits that are not tied to stories. And we leverage the data and we leverage the data collectors to get to that information. So the condition builder is designed for policy builders to interact with. Data collectors are meant for developers. So let me show you what that data collector looks like. I'm going to use the external temperature data collector. Oh, sorry, I was still in policies. I meant to go into data collectors and go into external data temperature. So data collectors are also versioned. So if it changes over time, how you deal with it, we can manage that. But this is now a script. So if you're not a JavaScript person, and that's fine, then this is not the place for you. This is the place for your ServiceNow development team to build out generic ways to get to data that can be used. So we've defined, and by we I mean Joe. Joe defined this external data temperature, which looks at the latitude and longitude that are passed in, and already has a REST message defined that's going to check for weather. It's going to set the query parameters, and then it's going to execute it, get the data. It's going to log some things. It's then going to parse the output, and it's going to store the temperature because that comes from the REST endpoint that was called. And then it's now able to be leveraged in any policy that wants to look at external data, no matter where it comes from. And of course, the output is going to be the temperature and the HTTP status. That's probably just for testing purposes to make sure that we actually got a response. So this is the more complicated side, but this can look at any data again within ServiceNow. So we had our commits without work items that we looked at earlier. This is a part of our content pack, so you can't edit it, but you can look at the code for it. And this code, we've abstracted a lot of it. But again, this has more complex for a developer to leverage data, and we have some things to help, like we have just some scripts. But this is a scripted way that takes a list of artifacts, and as output will give you the number of commits without work items, the number of commits in the artifact, and percentages. All of this data can be leveraged. So if I were to build a new policy, so let's say I want to build a new policy, I can click on the new button and start saying we're going to have another temp check, if I can spell. And so I will save this, and I'm looking at version 1. Yes, I was. I keep doing this. I'm sorry. I meant to move into policies. That was for building a data collector, which you do the same thing. You click on new, but then you program it. I want to show how it's leveraged. So I'm going to make a blank policy. This is going to be another temp check. And so I'm going to save it. So now as I go into my policy builder, I'm in draft right now. So you'll see we even give you some information along the way. But I need to go and say I need to add a data collector. So I'm going to add my external data. You'll see these are all available for you. I'm going to leverage the external data temperature, and I'm going to give it maybe some manual input. We're just going to say we're at 0, 0. That's always a helpful one, and it's going to have these as outputs. So I'm going to say this is center. So I guess what is it like in London? Or not London? Further south. It's middle of the ocean, I believe. So that's going to look at external data temperature. I could add another one. I could say I also want to know about my security vulnerabilities and leverage this. So I would be looking at the data that comes in, and I have my artifact versions that's going to be used here. So I'm now able to use vulnerabilities looking at the artifacts, and I'm able to use the data temperature that's out in the middle of the ocean, by Africa. And these are now leverageable. So I could have a condition that says if the temperature is, let's say, less than or is, I'm going to assume it's in Fahrenheit. So I'm going to say if it's less than 74 degrees, no, not. Okay, and now I don't know why why I'm not. I should be able to type something in here because I want it directly. But if I were, I guess, gonna have to do a lookup. So I need to add a parameter that says temp. We'll just call this temp. And the default value is going to be 74. So if the temperature that would get passed in is less than 74, I could then also say and. So if it's less than 74 and we have any vulnerabilities, so security vulnerabilities, there can be no vulnerabilities, then we're good to go. So no vulnerabilities is true, then we're compliant because it's good weather. So you're supposed to be able to type in here. I do not know why my keyboard is not letting me type, because I could type in a log message that says the temperature is nice and there are no vulnerabilities, so we're compliant. And then I can add some additional things. So I can add another condition that's leveraging the data multiple times to say now we have, through my data collector, if the temperature is too high, is above, so greater than, this should just be greater than. And we look up my temperature again. And maybe we have another condition on that there are vulnerabilities. Then maybe if it's too hot and there are vulnerabilities, that's expected. So that's still compliant. You're able to leverage this data in order to build reusable policies that, if you're a policy person, doesn't require scripting. So this is a kind of a contrived example, intentionally, where I'm using temperature and vulnerabilities instead of data that's actually necessary. But if you have, through your either change or release policies, where a person is having to attest to some fact, some data, testing's good, legal has signed off, and there is data that we can look it up by leveraging our data collectors to get the data, and then you as a policy owner on how that data will be used, you can then automate the authorization of that policy. And once it's good, you publish it. So I can publish without testing and activate it. Some blank decisions. I'll remove this, and might require me to add an else clause. No, it didn't. Okay, good. So in this case, I now have a published policy called another temp check that if I were in DPR defining our templates, I could then use as a part of this template a policy, maybe in the development phase, that says I want to use the another temperature check as one of the requirements necessary to get out of deployment, or I'm sorry, out of build and into probably the next one is testing. I have to click here to go into the manage releases if I were to actually add it. But you're now able to leverage that policy as if it were shipped with ServiceNow. So I saw a couple of hand raises, Greg. I don't know if there are any questions that that we want to go over for now on the how to build a policy and the anatomy of a policy.
Yeah, we have a couple So one, these data collectors are for DPR only, or can these be used at other products?
So the data collectors, if they're built from within DPR, are kind of scoped to DPR. I believe there is a way. I'll have to check on it because we try to only, like, you'll notice there's these content sources where they're coming from, and I now don't recall if we're filtering, but it's a filter. So it's a probably, but I will actually have to check to see if they're usable in other areas where, and this is important, these are only leveraged within the policy as code engine. So if it's something where you need to get data routinely, I'd actually recommend doing something similar to what the DPR team does, which is we have a script include that does the bulk of the heavy lifting. Like you'll notice, this is a very small um, data collector. This is not a very small function. This is not a very small function. So I'd recommend having script includes that define the bulk of the logic. It just, that way you can leverage that script include in a variety of places.
Great. And then two more just about policies. So one, the DPR policy content pack plugin, does this require any specific module entitlement?
Just that you're entitled to DPR. So if you are it's ITSM Pro and the things that ITSM Pro is included with. So it's also Enterprise and I think it's now CRM entitlement. So you just have to have DPR. And if you have DPR, the core content pack is included with that entitlement. We are looking into having what I'll call industry specific content packs. And so those would come with the industry specific SKUs, but that is future. We don't have any that are being built right now. We are investigating if there are content packs that we should put together for industry specific verticals.
And then how are errors handled within policies that use REST APIs?
So that will come in two different ways. One, if you're within a data collector, so and that was actually something Joe did. You'll notice that Joe has a little catch here and logs an error. And honestly, you could probably have another output that said that there's an error that was handled here. So your data collectors should kind of catch and handle any errors and either pass them through as a part of the variable output, at the very least should log them. Now within the actual policies themselves, we have a variety of different choices. I'm going to go into mine because so there are various decisions. You will have to decide whether that's compliant or non-compliant when an error occurs, but you can have output types, including like a warning. So maybe you say if there's an error from it that you mark it as compliant. I'm not sure, that would be an internal call as to how to handle those, but you definitely want to warn, if not create an error, a failure output type that documented that we were unable to collect information.
Yeah, I
And I
think
thought, are there any new ones? My little thing came up for a moment saying that there was another chat, but
no, I can answer a couple of them in the chat. So if you have anything else you want to finish before we wrap.
yeah, no, I was about to say, because we're at about 4 minutes till, I was going to make sure there weren't any other outstanding questions. And if not, I'm assuming, Greg, you've already posted into the chat the link to our community site, but we do have a playbook. DPR was designed to be a more turnkey solution when you're just getting started. So so long as you know what your kind of release process looks like, even if you're not yet to pulling things out of change and putting them into release, you can start that process. And we have an adoption playbook with guidance on how to get started. And our community sites, we have a lot of content there. With every release, we post videos that go over the kind of core features. And we do have a quarterly release for DPR. And we support the current version of ServiceNow and one back. So right now we are supporting Xanadu and Yokohama. And we will continue that until our November release. Oh, December, shifted to December. Our December release will drop Yokohama and it'll be Zurich and Xanadu. So even if you're not on the latest version of ServiceNow, you can still start leveraging DPR. And again, our community site has a lot of content. But are there any last questions, Greg? We've got about 2 minutes left that I can either answer, or if not, then thank you everyone for joining.